I'm your stand-in.
Last year I was only able to take like 2
Do I have to?
For this year, I'm taking the whole 2.
Greetings all, and thank you for being here. I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Tonita Gonzalez. Antoinette Gonzalez is a traditional healer. She works with the UNM Curanderismo program, so you saw cards about that. And that's coming up, and if you're interested, she's the person to talk to. She is, I didn't bring her formal bio, but what I can tell you is she is a healer at heart and a teacher and a fundamentally to the core spiritual human being who is leading the way into our new way of being in this world. And I'm so pleased that she's here. I'm also very interested in her topic. The title of her talk is Spiritual Justice in Healing. And we've talked a bit about that, but I'm interested in her perspective around how that can happen in a very multicultural state with lots of different approaches to spiritual healing and physical healing, and what's offered in the mainstream and what's offered outside mainstream. So please help me welcome today Tonita.
Good morning, thank you. I don't always use microphones, but can you guys hear me okay? Is that okay? I'm actually going to do this talk in a little bit different way. I know most of you guys, some of you have met me before, you've heard me before, but we're going to do this in a little bit different approach. I'm going to talk a little bit about the UNM Curanderismo program. Some of you guys have taken that class, but just so that we can get that formality out of the way. The UNM Curanderismo program is really innovative and has been a tremendous success, but is also really, at this point, has really started to see changes across, because of its success, across the country and really across the world. It started 16 years ago. I'm really honored that today one of my teachers and one of the pioneers of the program, it started with Dr. Cheo Torres. 16 years ago. It started with the first class of 20 people here in Albuquerque that took the class. One of the first teachers that was here is actually here with us today, and that's Rita Navarrete. She is actually one of the pioneer teachers that came from Mexico. There's actually 40 teachers took a bus. It took them 3 days and coming up on a bus from central Mexico and southern Mexico to get here at that time. It talks about the diligence of how they came up to be able to teach us their wisdom and how they were still working with traditional medicines. But what it did is it didn't come and teach us something that we didn't already know within our roots here. My family has been in New Mexico since the 1500s. My family is from south of Las Vegas, New Mexico. But what it helped us do was to remember what was already in our roots. Remember what our family was practicing. Remember who we were. Because our families were doing it, they just weren't talking about it as much. So we needed to be awakened up and say, really say, this is who we are, this is what we're practicing, but not to be ashamed of it. It allowed us to be proud of our roots. So this wasn't something, it allowed us to be integrated because we had this in part of colonialism here and in part of Western medicine. A lot of people became ashamed of using the medicine, became ashamed of using herbs, became ashamed. We were actually taught, it almost became abusive when our grandmothers would say something like, I use tea or manzanilla. Even in our current medical system now, the current medical system says, don't give your babies any teas, just not even water, just give them breast milk. And that's really counterintuitive to the way that our babies need healing. We actually can still, especially in a dry state like New Mexico, still give them chamomile, which is manzanilla, or alucema, because we deal with a lot of dehydration. We're very different from other states. And it's not abusive. And this is a great example when we talk about these teas, because If a doctor here tells somebody, if their grandmother's at home, and they say to the daughter, I want you to give him the baby's colicky, and I want you to give him some alusema or lavender tea, but they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, don't give them any tea. That's bad for them. They may not go home and tell their grandmother what the doctor said, but what happens is they're ruining the relationship between that person and the trust they have in their grandmother. All of a sudden, they're thinking that their grandmother isn't wise, their grandmother is incorrect, and they're destroying spiritual and cultural relationships. Now, we can talk about intent. The doctor is not intending to do that, but indirectly it's happening. So for years of generational problems, we see that type breaking down, and it's really, at the basis of when I talk about spiritual justice and healing within our communities, that's where we start breaking up ties. So that's really where I want this talk to go to, is how do we start building up those relationships so we start changing that healing? So when we say, how did this power from this UNM class start? How did that poder, when we say that, give us the strength to start taking that back and say, no, there's something really wrong. Our people are really sick when we're starting to depend, when most of our patients say, I'm waiting for the doctor to give me a magic pill. They're not looking to their grandmothers and their ancestors and their grandfathers who used to live off their land for the medicine anymore. They're looking to a pill to find the answer. It's like they're not looking to the right source. So we needed to do a huge shift. So 16 years later, a lot of this has shifted. And where has the UNM class gone is that right now we have about 350 to 400 people that enroll in our class every summer. It's a phenomenal class that goes the spectrum, from community members to farmers, all the way up to doctors, PhDs in all fields, from agriculture to medicine to psychology. Every field is in the class. And it's an anthropological class on how we can rebuild social values, spiritual values, look at mind, body, spirit healing in a very broad spectrum. We teach across the country. We've gone from everywhere, from the Smithsonian to the University of Minnesota, from Pacifica Clinics in California. So we have a broad way of how we're getting out in community and getting the message. As a matter of fact, we started 2 years ago with the Coursera class, where we had 45,000 people in the class and 175 countries. So this is how we're getting the word out, because one of the things about curanderismo, which stands for how we heal in traditional medicine, we don't want people to understand that it's not just your medicine, it's understanding your own roots, it's understanding your own culture. It's interviewing your grandmothers. It's interviewing your neighbors. Finding out if you're not living in your community where, because whether we like it or not, the whole US, we have people that lived here on the land that were already here, and then we have people that come as immigrants. And if you're living here as an immigrant, learn from the people that are here. What are the plants that are growing outside your door? Mm-hmm. Learn from them. Learn what that medicine is, because right now you have roots that are here. They may not be as deep, but those roots are there. And there's a beautiful thing about any indigenous or traditional medicine is that the earth is going to give you the medicine. So if right now you've been here, or your generations have been here 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, the earth is going to give you the medicine that you need. So you need to start connecting with this earth as if it is your own, and start taking care of it and having a shift of consciousness. That's what that spiritual change is. So that's kind of where we're shifting when we start talking about the UNM Curanderismo class, is what that is. What does that look like? So those of us that are here from New Mexico, there's something that is really close to my heart and we really want to start looking at. And I've been pondering this, and this has been coming to me in my dreams and things for a while. I also, in my other hat of life that I've been working with curanderismo, is I work with the hospital here at the University of New Mexico, and I'm on a board called Chile. It's the Chicano Hispanic, the Collaborative for Hispano-Latino Health Equity. And the University of New Mexico is a Hispanic serving institution that needs to look at the health equity for everyone. And what we've noticed is that there are some disparities of health, and when we look at disparities of health, we have to look at the social determinants of health. And we know that right now, the social determinants of health, when we look at poverty, when we look at housing, when we look at things that determine people's health, there's no equity. There's no equity in this state, and there's no justice. And one of those big justices for me, when we really look at it, is social justice and spiritual justice. Because one of the things that we were approached about, Rita and I, about 3 years ago, and this was a study done by the National Institute of Health. We were asked by the Addictions Council, is that the #1 group of suicides across the nation, attempted suicides, were Hispanic women. Between the ages of 17 and 27 were Hispanic women. And the study that they did that determined why these women were the ones that were attempting suicide was all due to acculturation, which is a big word that they found no culture within their medicine. There was no culture within psychology. There was no culture. When they go to the doctor, there's nothing that looks like them, that sounds like them. They couldn't identify that to them. They couldn't identify it to their spirit. And what does that mean? And it's kind of interesting because in these past couple of weeks, to be able to verbalize it and say, what does that mean to say, what does it mean spiritual justice? Is that when we go to the doctors, me being a Hispanic woman, going into the medical doctor, how does that generate healing for me? Because when I was little, and I would heal or I would get sick, the moment that I got a cold or a flu, my grandmother was at my house. If I would had a flu, the first thing that she would do is she'd bring a big pot of atole, which is the cornmeal drink. If I had a respiratory infection or I was just emotional, she'd bring a bowl of caldito, which was for me potatoes and meat. That's all it was. But also the first thing that she would do when my grandmother came over is that she would touch my head. And she'd be like, "Are you okay?" Or she would grab my hand and she'd just hold my hand wherever I was. Or every Sunday she'd just hold my hand. Because